This is Gustav Gressel here, visiting fellow at ERIC, and I welcome you to another episode of Battlefield Breakdown. If you're a bit confused about the setting here, the strange lightning and the abnormal background, I'm here in Kiev and recording this from a hotel room, so this is a bit abnormal, but of course on the ground, maybe a bit interesting. So this episode of Battlefield Breakdown, I will cover Ukrainian artillery, particularly as the 2S-22 Bohdana Howitzer produced in Ukraine has hit the news. It's a howitzer that is produced now in mass, set to be at a production rate of 10 guns per month. More than 80 should be in service by now. And that, of course, is a major step forward for Ukrainian artillery in terms of mass application of self-propelled howitzers. It's a 155mm L52 gun, so with a quite good range and capable of shooting Western type of artillery ammunition. But why is it so important, and why is a high output of artillery pieces particularly important for the Ukrainian army? Well, artillery in this war has been the most lethal branch of all our branches in the armed forces, followed maybe by drones. But artillery, especially if you look at the initial phase of the war, basically has the crown for king lethality. That, of course, has historical roots. If you remember back the Red Army in World War II, all of its major breakthrough battles were prepared by extensive artillery bombardments. The heavy use of artillery was a distinct feature of the Red Army, especially during the more successful phase of the Red Army following the Battle of Kursk and then towards the defeat of the Third Reich. The importance of artillery and artillery systems then also played a role in, if you look at how the Soviet Union then conceptualized war. For the socialist theory of warfare, warfare was a science, not an art, as seen in Western or in German wars theory. So one should, at least on paper, scientifically distinguish the forces that you would need to create a certain military output, and this was of course predominantly rated in force superiority. A attacking force would need to break the defenders, and here in Soviet mathematical models, of course, artillery superiority featured very large and was very important to achieve a breakthrough. Also in an old Soviet doctrine, maneuver, or why we in the West know that maneuver needs to be covered by fire. This was the same in the Soviet doctrine, although the Soviet doctrine had always a distinct difference between direct fire, which they called fires, and indirect fires. You should always have indirect fire cover. Direct fire was never said to be a substitute for indirect fire cover and indirect fire support. So a great importance placed on artillery and the availability of artillery systems. Now, also the next thing that might explain some stuff today, the most important artillery schools of the Red Army were, of course, situated in the Ukrainian SSR back then. Hence, of course, a lot of Ukrainians featured prominently in the Soviet Artillery Corps, and this kind of knowledge was, of course, then transferred into the newly independent Ukrainian Army post-1991. And of course, so no surprise, artillery features prominently in the Ukrainian army. And what reinforced that was, of course, then the Donbas war from 2014 up to the full-scale invasion of 2022. Most of the time of the Donbas war, parties fought under the condition of the Second Minsk Agreement, a supposed ceasefire agreement that never meant ceasefire. And this ceasefire agreement had a provision that all guns with a caliber larger than 10 centimeters need to be withdrawn to a zone beyond 30 kilometers away from the contact line. That, of course, meant problems for Ukraine because anti-tank warfare, anti-tank defenses were predominantly built on the availability of guns. Ukraine at the time did not have too many anti-tank guided weapons. Of course, it developed anti-tank guided weapons like the Stuga P, which probably you also have seen on videos featuring in this war, but especially at the beginning they were not so prolific. So the best defensive means against enemy armored attacks, which you always had to expect from the Russian side, were of course artillery, and you had to pull them back. Plus the OSCE played an emphasis on demining So the second moment of defending yourself is, of course, to mine the area in front of you, so that any advance on the Russian side would require the use of engineers, which would, of course, slow down an enemy attack. But because of the emphasis on demining and Ukraine's dependency on goodwill from the international community, that could not be used so extensively. So, of course, artillery was essential, but Ukraine had to keep the artillery mobile. You basically had pre-prepared firing positions, and the staging area for artillery was somewhere beyond the 30-kilometer zone. And when a Russian attack was either ongoing or imminent, then Ukrainian artillery had to move very fast into the zone, conduct this fire mission, and exit the 30-kilometer zone before service could get there. And that commanded for very fast artillery. And that's basically the developmental time of the Bohdana when it was conceived and where it was planned to be constructed. First prototypes were ready at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. However, at the time they were assembled in Kharkiv, and because the Kharkiv plants were in the immediate danger of being captured or destroyed, prototypes, machinery, and technical documentation were taken, disassembled, and taken away, evacuated to other sites which remained classified, and then production was restarted. That delayed the introduction of the system for roughly a year, but of course now it's there. Then, of course, artillery in the full-scale invasion also played a huge and important role. At the beginning of the war, infantry, the famous infantry with javelin that was usually very prominent in the media, and prepared ambushes in urban areas where most reporters covered them to slow down Russian armor. But artillery then basically, once the Russian armor was static, had the job of destroying the Russian columns. The same was true for the countryside, where mechanized brigades, tank brigades performed the same purpose. They stopped the Russian advances, and once Russians were stationary and engaging in the firefight with Ukrainians, Ukrainian artillery reined in and finished off the Russian advantages. If you probably remember all the pictures of Bucha, the main road being completely littered with burned out Russian vehicles, and Irpin, the approaches to Irpin, being a parade of destroyed vehicles. Most of these vehicles were destroyed by artillery. Very prominently at the time featured a regiment of 2S7 8-inch heavy artillery pieces, which were present in Kiev at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and then of course went to full work in the north of Kiev to destroy as much Russian armor as possible. And basically this pivotal role for artillery remained. The biggest problem then from April, May onwards was the availability of ammunition. Ukraine had a 6-week war reserve. That is actually quite much if you compare it to other NATO countries. Without any imports, Ukrainian artillery could fire at a full war mode for 6 weeks. But of course, then they needed artillery shells from abroad. And artillery shells from abroad were hard to come by. Bulgaria was the first country that on larger scale delivered artillery shells, then joined by Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland. But of course, the problem was that these stocks were limited, that the armies the stocks came from were rather small. And hence, these reserve stocks were, of course, quickly dwindling if you have the war consumption in Ukraine in mind. And so beginning of May, we had discussions on the delivery of artillery systems to Ukraine to keep the Ukrainian artillery up and running, 155 millimeter to be precise, to make use of much larger production capabilities in these calibers. Basically, from there we are. Ukrainian artillery is still very important. It is still highly lethal. You can see that in the impact of artillery shell deliveries to Ukraine on the battlefield. We had a time of extensive shell hunger, basically starting in December 2023, going roughly to May, late May of this year. And during this year, not only the number of Ukrainian casualties rose dramatically, Russia conquered not only Avdiivka, but also further ground to the west. Also, the losses in tanks, in armored vehicles in Ukraine skyrocketed because with the lack of artillery shells, other system, and exposure or indirect fire had to make up for the lack of firepower of the Ukrainian defenders, and hence you saw also a dramatically increase in losses in all sorts and types of equipment due to the lack of artillery shells. Ukraine also in this war pioneered the use of electronic automated command and control systems for artillery, the GIS-ARTA system, which is very effective. Ukrainians that received the first Western type artillery systems in 2022 brought some samples of the GIS-ARTA systems to the West to see how to integrate Western artillery systems into the GIS-ARTA systems. And I know this from German artillerymen observing this. They were pretty impressed what this system can do and how effective it actually is. Even though it uses commercial off-the-shelf products, it is very, very creative. And the use of drones to reconnoiter and measure enemy positions then only reinforced the efficiency of this system, leading to very fast, very precise artillery fire. And with proper ammunition and with precise Western artillery systems, Ukrainian artillerymen much more effective in using their shells because they needed much fewer shells to destroy a single target on the battlefield. And they could also engage individual armored vehicles even on the battlefield with indirect fire, which is something you need a very high degree of accuracy and a very fast processing fire control system for your kill chain from the spotter to the shooter for. Ukraine frequently managed to do that, which is a testimony to the high standard. But now back basically to the Bohdana and why do you need wheeled artillery, or what's the advantage of wheeled artillery? So if we still remember 2022, Ukraine did use two different types of artillery systems, wheeled self-propelled, tracked self-propelled, and then the towed systems. But the towed systems quickly fell out of favor because they need a long time to be set up and to withdraw from station. They are particularly vulnerable to counter battery fire and drones. So basically tracked self-propelled and wheeled self-propelled systems were the main arbiter of the artillery war. Both have advantages and disadvantages. As conceptualized, like the Bohdana wheeled artillery systems, also like the Caesar or the Slovak Susana, their advantage was their road speed. And the concept was that you have a staging area in the very rear. The very rear location of the staging area would protect these systems from preemptive artillery attack because they're far beyond the range of enemy artillery. And then it would quickly drive towards the firing position, which they can, because of the high road speed, do very fast. They can also cover a wide area of the front because due to the high road speed, they can quickly deploy into any direction from the staging area, then set up the firing position, which is quickly done with these highly automated systems, conduct the firing mission, and before enemy counter-battery fire strikes at their position, they already have withdrawn and are out of the firing area on their way back to the staging area where they await further orders. The tracked artillery system, usually they were heavier protected, so they were less vulnerable to counter-battery fire, splinters, etc. Panzer 2000 from Germany even had reactive armor on the roof to protect itself from enemy cluster munition. So these systems were to stay a bit closer to the front, but use their tracked chassis to access all terrain around them and have very unpredictable firing positions and areas because they can access not only the immediate terrain around main roads, but basically all terrain that is around them, conduct the firing mission, and then of course withdraw to the bit closer staging areas because they're not that fast. These were the two concepts. Now, basically, all of these concepts were or are now irrelevant because the type of artillery or the way of artillery employment became different when Russia used Lancet drones or started to use en masse Lancet drones for counter-battery fire. What is counter-battery fire? That is basically you want to eliminate the enemy's artillery position. So you have radars or other sensors up that locate a firing enemy battery, and then the old conservative type was to make your artillery shoot back at the enemy positions. Therefore, the quest for artillery superiority for a long time was a quest for longer artillery barrels, because if you have a longer barrel and can shoot further, you can, of course, stage your artillery further away from the front line and hence make it more difficult for the enemy's artillery to reach yours. And this was one of the main problems the Russians had with Ukrainian artillery, especially after they got the very long-barreled Western type artillery like the Panzer Howitzer, like the Caesar, like the Swedish Archer. They're very long-range systems that can outrange Russian systems by a considerable margin. And for the most modern Russian long barrel systems, the barrels were burning through at a much too high rate. And in the year 2023 already, a lot of Russian artillery was down to 2S1s or D30s or 2S3s and D20 artillery pieces, which have much shorter barrels and hence actually can't reach Ukrainian artillery. So what the Russians did was to improvise and to start to use Lancets as counter-battery fire means, because of course a drone has a much longer range and these kind of loitering munitions can penetrate quite deeply into the rear, and they have changed the nature of counter-battery fire, because firing with your artillery pieces you can only fire at the firing position you've spotted. But the Lancet drone, then, it basically hovers over the area where the firing position is suspected and then starts to detect and pick up the howitzers as they're on the move back to their staging area. And on this way, regardless whether they're tracked system and moving in the terrain or whether they're wheeled system moving on the road, artillery systems are all vulnerable to attacks by Lancet drones, because the Lancet drone doesn't care how fast you move, it moves faster. And that led to a change in concept. Now the staging areas of Ukrainian artillery are usually well defended and well protected, prepared tree lines or forested areas where drones have difficulties in first detecting artillery, but second also to strike, because in the trees you can hang up anti-drone nets and you can build shelters with additional armor, and in these shelters the artillery is quite protected regardless whether it's wheeled or tracked. And from there, they move out to relatively close firing areas, because you want to minimize the transition time from your protected shelter to your firing position in which you're vulnerable, execute a fire mission and then deploy back. That made the kind of quest for road speed less relevant, for which the Bohdana was initially developed. But the Bohdana has another huge advantage over especially tracked vehicles. It's much more reliable in terms of maintenance based on commercial trucks. First Ukrainian trucks, now it's a Czech Tatra truck. Ukrainian army is a mobilized army. You have a lot of people who came from civilian jobs. Tatra trucks are not that difficult to repair. Training newbies on repairing and maintaining it is arguably easier than on a very specialized equipment like the Panzer Howitzer 2000 or other tracked platforms, which a normal truck or car mechanic has probably never seen in his life. The reliability of the system is less prone to parts breaking, to very specialized parts breaking that are hard to come by, like specialized tracks, driving gears, driving brakes for tracked vehicles, etc. Basically, this is a commercial truck on which it's based. So you have higher availability because more gun systems spend their time on the battlefield as in the repair shop. Also, the big advantage of the Bohdana is that the barrel itself is produced in Ukraine. Barrel lives and spare barrels are a critical item now for both the Ukrainian and the Russian artillery. The Russians burn their artillery barrels through at a very high rate, and actually you can see that on satellite pictures. That in a lot of Russian artillery depots you see now old artillery systems with their barrels removed. That's because these barrels have been used in other systems as spares. On the Ukrainian side, of course, the availability of spare barrels by Western industry is an issue, because the Western concept of artillery use is a bit different. Usually we should use, according to our doctrine, artillery fewer times a day and with fewer rounds fired per combat day. That means that Western planning for spare parts, for spare barrels, has not been up to the reality of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Production of extra spare barrels at the rate Ukraine needs them is something that needed time to ramp up in the West. And unfortunately, it's quite expensive to do that in the West, while it's actually much cheaper to do so in Ukraine. And hence, spare barrels for Western systems have been a consistent problem in the Ukrainian arsenal. And this is a problem that is much easier to come by with the Bohdana because it's locally produced, and the kind of feedback chain from the armed forces to the defense industry, how much you need, at what pace, at what time you need, how many barrels, is much shorter and hence with less friction. So the availability of these systems that are in Ukraine is much higher, or, well, depending on which Western system you compare it to, but it's considerably higher than with other systems. And that's, of course, a huge advantage of the Bohdana. And beside that, it's an awesome piece of artillery, and it does amazing work. With this short explanation, I conclude this update of the battlefield breakdown. I wish you all a good week and good luck from Kiev, and see you in the next episode.